Our third presenter is Samuel Rodgers. The title of his paper is James Baldwin Across Literary Forms.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to our panel. So I study English and economics, and my project looks at the work of American author James Baldwin. Baldwin was one of the most important essayists, novelists, activists in the 20th century, and his involvement in the civil rights movement was extreme enough that during his career you wouldn't be wrong to call him an activist first and a writer second. His legacy has always seemed kind of somewhat rooted in the civil rights movement. And so what's been happening lately in the last couple of years is somewhat surprising, and that's that Baldwin's audience actually seems to be growing. More and more people are talking about him and his works. And you could say he's having a sort of moment 50 years after the publication of most of his famous books. And so this growing interest is both celebratory and political. Plenty of people are realizing just how good of a writer he is for the first time, but more importantly, Baldwin has become a crucial resource for combating modern racism. And there are a couple of ways we can contextualize this. The first is just paying attention to the prevalence of Baldwin's name and coverage of acts of racial violence. So I've pulled some news headlines, 4 of which are just from the last few months. They're sort of overly blunt, but I think you can get the idea from them. And when we're having these conversations about Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, any other tragic death that is indicative of a deeply troubling racial divide in our country, we're consistently turning to Baldwin to help reconcile this divide more so than we're turning to some of his contemporaries, so Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright, for instance. And so also in February, when the New Yorker unveils a cover celebrating both a research center for black culture and also just Black History Month generally, Baldwin's front and center. He's kind of the focal point of the entire piece, right alongside these other icons of black culture, Malcolm X, Zora Neale Hurston, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, and so on. So this popularity even seems to be rising in the literary community, in which Baldwin has always enjoyed popularity. He's always been considered one of the best, most important American authors. Just last year, for example, the inaugural issue of the James Baldwin Review was published. We can also understand this phenomenon quantitatively somewhat. This is kind of a robust, not that robust of a graph, but we'll see. It's a graph for search interest on Google, and so it shows what people in a certain geographic region, United States in this example, are typing in their search bars, and this is the last 5 years. So this one specifically is the trends for the 3 authors I've mentioned: James Baldwin's blue, Richard Wright's red, Ralph Ellison's yellow. And what's notable about this is that these are authors that shared audiences. They were in constant conversation with one another, textually and orally, so you can kind of compare them. But then if you map their popularity over just the last 5 years, decades after the end of their careers, decades after they've died, if you map the popularity in all categories, so not just books and literature, politics, news, even things like quotations, Baldwin in 2014 sort of takes off. The blue line sort of moves away, and a pretty significant percentage away from them. And this can't really be attributed to 50th year anniversaries of publications or, spikes like that. So every February you see Black History Month. There's a huge spike in all 3 of them, which is kind of sad in my opinion. But his presence in the media, people's interest in hearing about him, it's going up objectively. It's kind of hard to deny. So all 3 of these writers are remaining pretty relevant, but it's easy to see that Baldwin's actually kind of taking off rather than stagnating. And broadly, my project was just trying to find out why. I wanted to know why this was happening. What spurred this sudden political application reemerging interest? Specifically, I argue that Baldwin remains a crucial resource for combating racism because of his adaptability across the many forms he employed. And so he was a novelist, essayist, playwright, poet, debater, commentator. You could keep listing these. And I think it's his attention to the strengths of these various forms that ensures his relevance today. However, regardless of whether this moment that's happening is interpreted as artistic or political, what comes with Baldwin's enduring appeal is the unfortunate truth that he's being circulated out of context. What I mean by this is that the news headlines I just showed you, a lot of the articles are talking about Baldwin in a way that demonstrates their lack of familiarity with his actual writing, which is kind of funny. But the challenge of my project was to kind of study Baldwin in these 2 contexts, which is to say I wanted to continue the rich critical conversation that's never really ended about Baldwin, but to do so in light of his very recent political relevance. And so in order to do this, I basically turned to the traditional critical approach, close reading texts, and did sort of a survey of Baldwin across 3 forms. And so my project was divided into 3 sections: fiction, film, nonfiction. So this is the first. This is about as complex of a visual as I can give you. The first section is on fiction, so on specifically the development of the central metaphor of Baldwin's 3rd novel, which is Another Country. It's published in 1962. And the focus here is the power of extended metaphor within a plot structure that focalizes complex overlapping relationships. So in other words, this particular argumentation regarding the value of love in the face of racialized hatred which is the unifying thread of Baldwin's career, it's only possible in a novel. So one of the characters, when I say the metaphor, what I mean is that one of the characters, Ida Scott, repeatedly insists that those around her need to pay their dues, and this is a quotation from her. "You don't have any experience in paying your dues, it's going to be rough on you, baby, when the deal goes down. There's a lot of back dues to be collected, and I know damn well you haven't got a penny saved." So Ida's articulation relies on understandings of literal reparation in order to refer to a figurative debt that's harder to articulate. And by doing so, this metaphor accomplishes two crucial tasks. First, since it casts hatred and love as a means of exchange, it reiterates the novel's organizational themes of love and togetherness as a harmonizing force for suffering. And second, as mentioned, it reveals one way in which Baldwin's argument is framed with attention to the rhetorical potential of the novel form specifically. This novel observes the potential reconciliation of the destruction of its black protagonist, whose name is Rufus, and Ida's metaphor is the most concise articulation of this reconciliation. So on the simplest level, it's just a bridge between fictional characters. It's Ida's attempt to frame racial suffering in terms that white characters can understand. Since these characters grow in accordance with their grasp of the implications of her metaphor, it's just a plot device on one level. So one character, Cass, suffers due to her inability to pay her dues, while another character, Vivaldo, eventually secures love, but not without quite a bit of moral payment, in Ida's terms. On a higher level, though, it's the novel's most important argumentative flourish, a tool of empathy and potential for correction that bridges the gap that Baldwin seems so consistently adept at speaking across. This is only possible due to his multi-layered treatment of the metaphor, the way it functions in different contexts, the way it evolves. And that's kind of what I spend the entire section talking about. And so now we'll move to my second section on film. I'm just going to touch on this briefly in the interest of time. But basically, these are stills from each of the two films I look at. On the left, we have Take This Hammer, which is a documentary from 1963 about Baldwin's visit to San Francisco. And while there, he kind of talks to its black citizens about their displacement from San Francisco because of the ongoing gentrification in the communities there. Excuse me. And then the two stills from the right, very blurry, low quality, best I can do, are from Baldwin's debate at Cambridge with the conservative intellectual William F. Buckley. And so I'm sure Amanda could educate me on the debate stuff way more than I can tell you. But basically, I approach the second piece as a sort of counter to the first section. Whether racial debt can be erased spatially and symbolically is a question that Baldwin approaches quite differently depending on fictional dialogue versus his own actual dialogue in these sort of extended interviews. And so now I'll move to my last section, which is this is where I focus on nonfiction and where I bring Baldwin into the present. And here I compare his seminal work of nonfiction, The Fire Next Time, with Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2015 book, Between the World and Me, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And the premise of this section was that you just simply can't have a conversation about Baldwin in the present without addressing Coates' book. An evaluation of Fire that focuses on its contemporary resonance will be incomplete without considering this text as well. And this is a text which constantly reasserts Fire's importance as it celebrates its formal and structural choices. Put sort of bluntly, if you're not familiar with either of these texts, they're just both long-form essays that discuss structural racism in kind of intimate ways and acts of racial violence in America, but 50 years apart from one another. But I think the similarities between these two texts say a lot more about Baldwin in 2016 than they do about Coates in 2016. The main similarity that people love talking about is the epistolary framing device, so the fact that both texts share this intimate fatherly voice speaking in an open letter to a son, in Coates' case, nephew in Baldwin's case. And this primarily serves as a way to ground arguments. It creates a juxtaposition between the harsh topic, the comforting context of a letter. These are harsh realities that are incongruous with the type of intimacy that such a letter conveys. And, its main rhetorical function is a structural reminder of its central theme of familial unity in the face of racial hatred, separation. Baldwin is always adept at framing complex socio-political issues into an intimate communal conversation without sacrificing the gravity of those issues. And so that's something we see Coates being quite good at as well in both of these, using the letter format. But that being said, I think the way that Coates utilizes the legacy of Fire is a lot more nuanced than that. You wouldn't have so many people comparing him to Baldwin if the stylistic choices, similarities stopped there. The main one I focus on in my section is their respective use of epigraph. So an epigraph, if you don't know, is just a short quotation from an outside source. It opens a text, kind of establishes a central theme going forward. And so both texts borrow their titles from and begin by invoking lyrical lines that position what follows as part of a much larger written tradition. I have the one from Fire on the left, one from Coates on the right. And so Baldwin offers the reconstructed biblical lines of a slave song, and then on the right, Coates provides the first stanza, but only the first stanza of 5 stanzas from a Richard Wright poem entitled Between the World and Me. But what's more crucial than the simple matter of the fact that these titles are taken from their epigraphs is that each text establishes and sustains an elaborate metaphor entirely dependent on these opening lines. The Richard Wright poem is all about a black narrator discovering that he's actually the victim of a lynching that he initially finds the remains of. It's kind of confusing chronologically. But that Ta-Nehisi Coates takes the poem, positions his own text between the setup of the black man realizing he is not a removed witness, but rather the victim of the destruction of his own body, and the revelation of that position is an utterly crucial interpretive tool for analyzing what follows. What is between the world and me in this poem is the historical reality of racism in the United States, the incongruence confronting a black person in the country once they try to make sense of their place within it. That incongruence can be a more abstract alienation brought on by concrete social and political realities, but as Coates frames it throughout his text, it's of the highest importance that we also remember that it can be as tangible as a lynching. In Coates' language, acts meant first and foremost to deny you and me the right to secure and govern our own bodies. That initial ellipsis then, at the end of the first stanza, suspends us between Wright's sooty details and the delivery of his cyclical retelling of the lynching. It displaces the final blow of our realization so that Coates can pick up where Wright left off and inform us how this degree of racial violence is happening right now in 2015. He is, in effect, obscuring the lynching in the same way that American history has tended to, but his choice of epigraph becomes the perfect early spark for his own scorching, elaborate, sustained retelling of the destruction of the black body. So turning back to Baldwin, the final pages of his own essay position his opening lines on the left there as something of a prophecy. If we, and by we Baldwin means the relatively conscious whites, the relatively conscious blacks, do not work together to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country, then what will follow can only be a fire next time, he just means a violence of biblical proportions. In summary, Coates' usage of epigraph positions his text as constantly considering past atrocities. This choice seems reactive to Baldwin's own use of epigraph, which is prophetic and thus in constant consideration of future atrocities. Coates does not just reconstitute the meaning of Wright's poem, he also reconstitutes the title of Baldwin's text. The fire next time, read as a prophetic warning of the consequences of racism, sounds a lot differently decades after that prophecy has been continuously realized. So if another country offers us a portrait of suffering induced by racial prejudice, and the fiery next time, like Baldwin's Conversations in Film, which I kind of skipped over, reconstructs the portrait outside of fiction, further making the case for the ubiquity of racial suffering while arguing for the necessity of its confrontation. Between the World and Me is just an important interpretive text in its role as another proponent of that same message. In conclusion, the collective goal of my three sections on the three forms is to one, illustrate Baldwin's rhetorical versatility, two, account for his current political utility, and three, redirect his value back into the literary context in which it originated. His lasting cultural relevance stems, I argue, from a particular kind of brilliance that defined his writing, his ability to write and speak fluidly beyond the generic and historic conventions of the past moments in which he composed. So what's the basis of his argument? In simple terms, in the face of racial hatred, black agency and self-realization win. His articulation of these truths remains current because it never seems to lose anything in translation across forms and across decades. Thank you.
So you mentioned that when you read these articles that are mentioning Baldwin, it becomes clear that the people who are mentioning Baldwin haven't read Baldwin. Mm-hmm. Say a little bit more about that.
Right. So if you go back, they have kind of the tendency to have these clickbaity titles. So 10 things James Baldwin never thought, like that. That alone kind of makes me skeptical. But then you go in and you read them, and a lot of them were spurred by the publication of Coates' book, which is why I felt the need to address it so thoroughly in my work. And so a lot of them are kind of comparing them on these very superficial levels. And the main way that happens is talking about the letter format over and over. Oh, Coates is writing a letter to his son. Baldwin did it to his nephew. And that's kind of, they stop there. And the fact that they stop there means that if that's the main thing they pulled from the fire next time, I'm kind of wondering if they even took a closer look at it, I guess.
You showed the Google thing for search terms.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the sales of Baldwin's text?
I've not. I actually couldn't find data on it because I tried to right before I was looking at that. And like I said, you could do a lot. If you were to control for interest in time for the category, so books and literature, you'd actually see that Baldwin takes off even more drastically. But I wanted to make it kind of more obvious that before 2014, these are authors that are enjoying the same amount of popularity among people searching for their words and their works, and then he kind of takes off. But financially, I think you could say that he's definitely enjoyed a lot more success since 2014 as well. Yeah, please.
Did you look into what Coates might have had to say about Baldwin?
Coates?
Yeah, what's his disposition toward it?
Oh, yeah. So he had many interviews after the publication of the book, which enjoyed quite a bit of success. And he has all these readings where he says, if you're in this room and you haven't read The Fire Next Time, you've already lost. So he'd be the first person to say, I should be an introductory point to Baldwin's legacy rather than substitute, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the critiques of Coates is that he's satisfying reading because he has beautiful moments, essentially. He's a gorgeous writer, but essentially what he does is he problematizes the world and he essentially tells you what's wrong, but he's short on solutions.
Yeah.
You find in reading Baldwin that somehow he gets past the gorgeous women part and moves towards something that's much more satisfying 50 years later about kind of appropriate next steps that's different from the critique of Coates.
Yeah, the main critique of Coates is that he's not as hopeful as Baldwin, but I think it's just because they're both a lot more honest in their respective contexts, so it's hard for him to be hopeful 50 years after Baldwin's saying, we are so close to being able to solve this problem, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure. I mean, reading Coates, it seems pretty hard to judge him for not having hope when so much of his book is based in personal experiences, so a lot of the violent imagery that he pulls is from his own life, so it'd be hard to critique him for that, I guess.
Does that mean thanking Sam?
Thanks.